Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show. Tonight, I would like to talk to you about Alan Klein. Now, Alan Klein was the Beatles' last manager. Now, in order to get to the meat of this video, let me tell you about Apple Records first. Apple Records was the company that Brian Epstein formed before he died. And it was a way for the Beatles to take all of the money that they earned and put it into a legitimate business. Because in Britain, when you earn a lot of money, you can't sit on that money. You have to turn it into a legitimate business. And Apple Records was not only a music company, it was also a boutique. It was also a management company, and the Beatles needed somebody to help manage that and them. Because after EMI, that's the company they recorded through, was their own company, Apple Records. Now, they needed to look for a manager because Brian Epstein died from a drug overdose in 1966. And so their affairs were not completely in order yet. So they went a year without a manager. And they needed one because John and Paul could not manage the band because they were busy with their own affairs, so to speak. So Paul already had somebody in mind for the management job, and that was Lee Eastman, his father-in-law. Now, Lee Eastman had a solid business background and knew the music business like the back of his hand. But most important, he was a legitimate businessman. He was not corrupt. Now, the other Beatles, John, George, and Ringo, wanted Alan Klein, but mostly John. John wanted Alan Klein. And by this point, I think it was 68, 69, John had a serious heroin addiction, and he was basically a junkie by this point. I mean, all of the Beatles did drugs, but John was the worst. He was the junkie of the band, and so that informed his decisions partially for his choice of Alan Klein. Now, the way the Beatles did things was through voting, and everybody in the Beatles had to vote on something for it to be a decision, and for it to be official. Now, for a yay vote, all of them had to vote yay. For a nay vote, all of them had to vote nay. There was no splitting votes. There was no thirds or one majorities or two. No, none of that. It either had to be unanimous yay or unanimous nay. Now, when it came time for them to select a manager, it was put up to a vote. Paul voted for Lee Eastman, his father-in-law. John, George, and Ringo voted for Alan Klein. And the reason why John also wanted Klein to be his manager is because Alan Klein, he claimed Alan Klein knew his lyrics and could understand his lyrics. And so for John, that was the most important decision, despite the fact that Alan Klein was corrupt, and despite the fact that even Mick Jagger himself came down to Apple Records when he heard what was going on and warned the Beatles, hey, you don't want Alan Klein as manager. He's our manager, or he was our manager, and look what he did to us. He's an asshole. You don't want to deal with him. But by that point, Paul was like, I have my own manager. They have their own manager. Let them deal with it. And this caused the biggest split in the Beatles because now they were no longer unanimously voting on anything. Also, John, George, and Ringo had their own manager, which was Alan Klein, and Paul had his own manager, Lee Eastman. So this way, they had two separate agents for two parts of the band. That's how bad things got. And when people want to blame Yoko Ono, which I don't like Yoko Ono to begin with, she was a user, a sociopath, and a gold digger. I'm sorry, I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for that, but it is what it is. She was also a junkie as well for a while, and she exploited that in John. But this was one of the start of a dark trend in the Beatles' history, where Paul and John were basically using their egos to get back at each other, just to basically get into these ego battles, because that's all it was. Yoko herself was an ego boost, basically. She was used by John to basically prove to Paul that he could one-up him. It was all just one-upping at this point. And not voting on Lee Eastman because Paul might be in charge of the band was proof of that. And here's another little detail that people don't understand. I talked about Apple Records earlier, but Apple Apple Records was also something that John and Paul fought over. You know, Paul would suggest one thing and John would completely disagree with him and basically say, no, I don't want that. And also, when it came to managing it, both just had different styles, completely different styles, or the opposite when it came to management of Apple Records. And that's why it lost a lot of money. Now, some of the acts, like James Taylor, and what was her name? I'm trying to figure it out here. There was James Taylor and Badfinger, and there's a bunch of other acts that were part of the Apple umbrella that succeeded later on. But all the other areas of Apple lost money. So Alan Klein was only the Beatles manager for a couple months. Well, actually, he was John, George, and Ringo's manager for a couple months because they soured on him after a while. They even got sick and tired of dealing with him. But Paul had the last laugh because for the rest of his life, in fact, for the rest of his professional career, he used Lee Eastman. And Lee Eastman was able to help him invest in music publishing rights, which netted Paul McCartney millions of dollars. So there you go. Paul had the last laugh in this scenario, unfortunately, when it comes to these ego battles. Well, thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Good night and stay fucking awesome.